future Felix, make sure you stick around to the end of this video because I have a very exciting announcement at the end.
Hello, welcome back to the Politics Relaxed podcast. My name's Cameron, I'm going to be hosting today, and on the panel today we have Felix, Jose, Pierce, Tommy and Daniel. Now, today we're going to be carrying on looking at coronavirus. The lockdown restrictions, should we tighten them? We've seen today the news that over 2 million people have died from COVID across the whole world. To be precise, here in the UK, 86,015 people have died, and over the past week, we have seen 1,000 deaths every weekday. We've now seen 3.26 million cases here in the UK, and of course, if you're looking at international comparisons, we've got the 7th highest deaths per capita, and we now know that the NHS is at breaking point. London is suffering the most. COVID patients are now being sent elsewhere, including all the way to Newcastle on the other side of the country. The other bit of bad news today was that in November, the UK economy shrunk by 2.6%, despite growth in the prior months. Now, we've just had an announcement in the last hour from the Prime Minister that the UK is going to close all travel corridors from Monday to protect against the risk of another new strain of the virus. This one's from South America. Now, today we're going to talk first about the lockdown restrictions. Should we bring more on, or should we leave them as they are and see how it goes? We're seeing a very different tone, actually, from the government and from the media in this lockdown compared to previous lockdowns, in that we're seeing a much less compliance. And so we saw Priti Patel very much having a go at the public and telling people, basically, you have to do this, it is your duty to the country. So, Jose, do you want to start us off with your views on lockdown restrictions? Should we tighten them?
Personally, I don't think there's much more you can do. Regardless of what will happen, people are angry with what's happened. In the first lockdown, back in March, people accepted it because they knew how dangerous it was. Then over the summer, when schools weren't open, the cases were pretty low. And then when schools reopened, the cases went extremely high. So I think people are just angry. You can make it so that you can't even leave your house at all to do anything, and people will still find a way to do stuff. So at the end of the day, do I blame what the people are doing? Yes, but I think now we have to focus more on fixing the problem. We're finding a different solution for stuff like hospitals and getting vaccinations out as quickly as possible to end what's happening. Because at the end of the day, it won't end until everybody is sorted out, basically.
Yeah, well, I have to disagree. I think we need more restrictions. But, of course, the government are going to be late to this. That's my big prediction is in 2 weeks' time, the government are going to go to Parliament and they're going to ask for voting on more restrictions. But it needs to be now, not in 2 weeks' time, now. Because every time they've been late, every single time, and this one cannot be the one because the NHS is a breaking point and people are putting their lives on the line. And the government need to respect that, and they need to put a new measure. And I also think it's disgusting, people breaking lockdown. They should not be doing that right now when people are putting their lives on the line for us, to keep us safe. They're putting their lives on the line, and that's why we need more restrictions and we need people to stick to them.
Pierce, do you want to respond to that?
Yeah, I would. I mean, in the briefing, like under an hour ago, Chris Whitty said that the peak for hospital administrations would be sometime in the coming week, and adding more restrictions onto that would seemingly be already too late, because if the hospital admissions are already going down.
Yeah, but it still needs to happen, whether it is late. I agree that it is late. But whether it's late or not, we still need the restrictions.
Right, let's talk a bit about the specifics then, because we're talking here about more restrictions, and I can appreciate that point, definitely. It's a reasonable point. We can see so far these restrictions, this lockdown restriction, hasn't made too much of a difference. In fact, the situation continues to get worse. And the two reasons for that are that perhaps the restrictions are not tight enough, and the second reason is that perhaps the public aren't following them. So what more restrictions can we add?
I'm very happy because they've finally introduced border checks. I think that should have happened months and months and months ago. There should have been some sort of border check, whether it is about COVID tests, and you need a positive one, or they test you and the border. There needs to be some sort of way to test people coming into the country, because otherwise they're just bringing in these new variants that we've seen now springing up all around the world. And that is very important. And I'm glad that the government have brought that in finally. The other thing is, the main thing for me is the exercise. You shouldn't be allowed to go out to exercise with a person from a different household because people take liberties on that. Every time we've seen that, people taking liberties from that.
Tommy.
Yeah, I think, like Jose said at the start, I think if we want to get anywhere with this, we need to have harder restrictions. The full lockdown was introduced, I think, 2 weeks ago now or something. And since then, we've seen a drop of 12,000 cases from last week. That's already a good start. But then again, we've seen today 1,280 daily deaths. But about further restrictions, I believe personally that there should be a complete lockdown. The only place you're allowed to go outside would be your property. And if you need to go to the shops, you should try to do it in a car. But no matter what we do, there will always be people who break the rules. We saw that with first lockdown. We saw that especially with like MPs. People, Boris Johnson went on a bike ride last week. He seemed happy about that. After announcing that the whole country should stay inside, and I think the governments on their parts, they've done their best putting us into this lockdown now. They could have done it earlier, but it's the people that now have to comply.
I actually agree with your sentiment. I think that the situation we're in is really concerning. And at the end of the day, we've got the vaccine coming along. It's progressing very well, the best in Europe, our vaccination programme at the moment. What we want to be making sure is that we can limit the deaths in the coming weeks. At some point, we will be able to get back to normal. But in the next few weeks, if we want to make a big difference, I do think we are going to have to go into stricter lockdowns. So I want to ask, what do we do now to stop the NHS from being overwhelmed? Because the NHS is at breaking point. I think the most important thing is that we get these nightingales open. That's really important so we can make sure that we have the right capacity. The next problem is definitely the staffing. That is one of the other limiting factors. And I think that's a key point there. So Daniel, I'll come to you.
I don't think we really should go into a stricter lockdown, really. I think cases are already plateauing. And if you stop people from being able to exercise and meet with one other friend, you're really going to see people's mental health, getting worse.
Mental health has been a big concern of mine throughout this, and I do think it's necessary that people are able to exercise. I also want to pick up on a point Tommy made earlier. I forgot to pick up on, which was the point made about Boris Johnson's cycle ride. I'd just like to say that was entirely within the rules, and I don't think there's a problem with going for a 9-mile cycle ride or whatever he did, because at the end of the day, 9 miles when you're on a bike is not very long. I mean, I walk 9 miles most days during lockdown. So it's not too significant, I think.
Yeah.
So Felix, I want to come to you.
Yeah. So I just want to again keep going on that Boris Johnson point before I get into my main one, which is just the day later, Matt Hancock changed the rules to make it within 8 miles of your home, and it's like that is the problem with that. I don't think cycling 8 miles, if it's in the rules, is perfectly fine. But when they change it to like kind of include Boris Johnson just where he went. But I want to kind of talk about how we could help the NHS more, because I'm glad that you finally recognise my point that the NHS is understaffed, and it has been because of Tory cuts. But I don't want to get into that again because I spoke about it quite heavily 2 weeks ago. But I do want to talk about how the lockdown was 2 weeks too late, because that was one of the biggest problems I think of this lockdown. It was 2 weeks too late. If you look at the SAGE advice, the SAGE letter, then it says that I quote, a November-style lockdown would not be enough on the new variant. That was 2 weeks before we went into lockdown. So once again, Boris Johnson has missed the mark. He's 2 weeks too late because of his just indecisiveness. He's not a good leader, and that's what we've learned throughout this pandemic. 2 weeks too late every single time is not enough. And you need a good leader who will make decisive decisions, not trying to pander to the whole population. You're never going to make the whole population happy. And that's what Boris Johnson he's tried to do, and he can't. It's ridiculous. He said 2 days before that, there is no need to change the rules about Christmas, he said. And then he got that letter. He knew about this new variant and how bad it was going to be because the SAGE advice was there, but he didn't act. He did not act. And that is another problem from this Tory government. Again.
Okay, so we're going to move on a little bit now. I think I want to talk about education, because we haven't actually had a podcast recording since the lockdown was introduced, since schools were shut, since GCSEs and A-levels were cancelled. And this is obviously, as young people, something that we find really important. So I think it's important that we do talk about this. So the closure of schools, what do you think about that, Tommy? Do you think that it's going to be detrimental to our students? Do you think it's necessary in the national interest?
Well, I could see parents that would obviously want the schools to stay open. Like, not all parents can keep their kids at home with them working at home. And I believe I saw a BBC News report of a head teacher who said first lockdown, the key workers, they had many of them in their school, and there weren't many kids coming into school because parents were probably, it's a first time for everyone. Not many people used to it. But she said second lockdown, this one, she's had too many kids and that she's had to turn away some of them. And I think the point with closing schools, I completely support it for primary schools and for a secondary school level up to year 9. But the thing is, I don't think it's sustainable, because parents, they obviously need to work, and not all parents can look after kids that are age 3, especially if you have like more than one. And I think if we're closing it up until year 9, I want to say they're less essential than year 10 and above. But then again, you learn so much in primary school, but stuff that could be covered at home. The first years of your education are quite important. You learn the most, I'd say, than you would ever in your first few years of education, because you're coming in with nothing. But for year 10 and above, it is absolutely essential for their studies. A-levels being cancelled and GCSEs being cancelled is going to be a really big impact on our tests should they go ahead. I completely support keeping the test going, because I would much rather do the tests than go based off a predicted score. I just don't think it's the right way to go. If it's COVID safe, that could be argued that it's not, because we've seen, like, I've seen teenagers hanging out in groups, definitely more than 6, and they're definitely not family members either. And it's going to be hard for some of them to follow the rules, which is why they're getting closed, even though it's much more important to our education.
Personally, my view on this is that actually the schools that should have been kept open are nurseries and primary schools. If you think about it, the parents of nursery and primary schools are typically younger. It's also very difficult for a parent who has a child of 3 years old to have to go on calls all day and then have to care for the child while being on a call. It's completely stressful for them. If you're in year 7 or above, you can take care of yourself. You can cook if you even need to. You can do a lot of these stuff. But if you're younger than that, you're going to struggle a lot without your parents' help at home. So I think that if the government are only really closing this, in my view on this is that the government closed all schools to reduce cases to make themselves look better. I think if you had kept primary schools and nurseries open, yes, the cases may have stayed a bit higher, but it also would have helped a lot more people.
It's a fair argument, and our schools are really important for children's mental health. But I think at the end of the day, you've got to look at these places of education, and the evidence has clearly shown that they are big vectors for transmission. And what we have seen is that any lockdown without all of education being shut down has been pretty much ineffective. So, and bear in mind that so far this lockdown has been fairly ineffective so far. You've got to think perhaps it was the right decision to have all of these education institutions shut. Right, now I want to move on to children's meals. So this is an issue that we've seen pop up yet again this week, as we saw. Right, now I want to move on to children's meals. Now it's another issue that we've seen pop up yet again this week. We saw Marcus Rashford retweeting a photo of an insufficient looking meal package from the private company Chartwells, and it was, I think, really shocking. I think everyone can agree on that. It's definitely not a political thing when it comes to judging how much food is sufficient for a child. When it comes to the government, the government did act quick on this. I want to talk about this first before we go into Felix, because I know Felix will probably be critical of the government. As soon as, on the same day, a few hours after this story came to light, the Children's Minister, Vicky Ford, opened an investigation straight away. The package that was photographed was below the requirements set by the government. I think it's important to say that, because I know Keir Starmer was saying that the government's requirements were insufficient, and I think it's true in the sense that the government's requirements are not massive, they're not generous, but then at the same time I do think it was sufficient. When we're talking about the Chartwells package, that was insufficient because it was, of course, below those requirements. So Felix, I want to go to you first.
Yeah, well, I think the government guidelines are definitely wrong, and you bring up the point on that, so I'll go into that first, because if you look at the meal that was shared widely on social media, I'm going to repeat what Keir Starmer said. The only difference between that and an example meal that the government put as sort of like a suggestion was a tin of sweet corn, a packet of ham, and a bottle of milk. That's the only difference between what we saw on social media and what the government guidelines. They say it's meant to be £30 worth a week, right? But the one we saw on social media was £5 worth a week. I'd say if you take into account the other two things there, let's say you're going for like something in the middle of the range, I'd say like £2, £2.30 more. So even still, that is nowhere near enough for what the government are providing. But even if the government guideline was sufficient, what we've seen is privatisation does not work. This government think they can offload everything to private companies and it won't affect it. It will. It's affected, once again, Tory privatisation has hit working class kids the hardest. Again, once again, we see it we see the NHS slowly being privatised. We've seen rail being privatised. We've seen loads of things over the years being privatised, and it hits working class people the hardest. And that is a major problem with Tory policy. And that is just like a fact, because we see it here. Privatisation does not work. They have hired a private company, and it's affected working class kids the hardest. And why does it take a social media scandal for the government to act? That's my question. Because once again, it's been widely shared on social media and then the government act. Why are the government not always investigating this? They shouldn't be just letting people run free with government money. They should be investigating this the whole time. And they should have known about this. They should have known what was in their own food packages, but they did not. That's why I say the government needs to return to the £30 voucher instead. But of course, MPs like Ben Bradley think it's going to be, and I quote, spent on crack dens. That's what he said. And that is completely wrong. And that is why you need £30 meal vouchers, and that's what needs to return, like we saw in the first pandemic. But once again, the Tories do not value working class families. They do not value working class kids like before. They voted against feeding them. They voted against feeding hungry children, and now they didn't even have any sort of review into what was going into their mouths. That is not good enough from this government once again, and we're going to see another U-turn.
It's not really true to say there wasn't a review, because they opened the investigation.
Okay, but they opened the investigation after Twitter shamed them. Why does it take a social media scandal to bring this government into action? It was like with the exams, the same sort of thing.
It was just about they had to be made aware about it.
They had to be made. Why are the government having to be made aware about what they're feeding kids? That is a real problem. Why does it take Why does it take a footballer to shame the government into action? Marcus Rashford will be a better Prime Minister than Boris Johnson, and you can quote me on that. Boris Johnson
he'd also be a better leader of the opposition than Keir Starmer, because last time I checked, it was Keir Starmer's job to point out this kind of thing, yet it took a footballer to do that, and only then did Labour pick up on it.
As soon as this was shared on social media, Keir Starmer, it's not his job to look into these packages. It's his job to hold the government to account, which he has done. And on he tweeted about it, and he asked a question in PMQs, which was the first opportunity he got to challenge the government in a month. And these were not in December. So actually, that's just completely ridiculous what you're saying. But Marcus Rashford would make a better Prime Minister than Boris Johnson. And you can quote me on that anytime.
Fine. Okay. So I want to talk about the specifics of the kind of options that we'd be looking at when it comes to feeding children. The ideas that have been bounced around, there's been the cash in hand idea, there's been the food vouchers idea. This food package idea was, of course, the one that was implemented this term. Now, I personally would have grave concerns about the concept of cash in hand, because of course the cash is going into the hands of the parents, and in many situations with some working class families, or not just working class, but families from any class, there could be situations in which the parents exploit that money to then spend on who knows what. So I'm concerned about the cash in hand concept a lot. The vouchers idea perhaps makes a bit more sense to me than the food package idea. So perhaps I would find myself leaning more towards that. But I actually want to go to Daniel, because I know Daniel's been relatively supportive of actually the package that was delivered by Chartwell. So let's go to Daniel, please.
Well, I only saw one the day that that you know the scandal was, or whatever you want to call it, and I thought that was probably enough for a child for 10 days. But I saw some of the other packages; they were terrible, you know, and they weren't £30 worth of food.
Let's see that. Tommy, you've got a point to make.
Yeah, going back to what you said about the cash in hand system, I think if I was someone who could barely afford to pay my bills and to pay for food every week, I don't think my first priority would be going to a crack den, if I'd be totally honest. And I think the government's way of subsidizing these meals, they have a really huge budget on this. They've seen how it's been publicized about 2 months ago, and they noticed that and are like, oh, okay, I have short-term memory, so let's put this food package together, even though we have the capability of making one much better. And may I remind you that these were the MPs that I quote complained about mustard and soggy hash browns. These people, we pay for their meals and they can't even afford to give something of value back, of anything. I think it's 5 days per person that box was meant to be, and it's failed and they got called out on it. And that it's happened all the time. They get called out on something, they fix it, and then a few months later, when they think no one's watching, they'll do it again.
Piss.
Well, I mean, I'm gonna divert a bit here, but Felix, you seem to want more government control of the people's lives, and I'm surprised that you've gotten through 2020 thinking that any form of government like cares deeply about the people and should have more control over everyone's lives. That's quite surprising. I mean, no, the role of a government is to care for the state, not the people. The like for example, like they do the international relations, they manage the economy, and but you seem to you seem to think that they should manage like every aspect of every individual person's lives without giving them the freedom to their liberties. I mean,
I don't think that's a fair point, to be honest, because I want to hold the government to account, but I want them to do a good job of what they are meant to do. I don't want them to surpass that. I just want them to do a competent job of dealing with a pandemic. That's all I want. I just want competent government. I disagree with the you saying that government shouldn't care for the people. That is the number one job of the government, to keep their people safe, to keep their people happy, and to keep them healthy. But this is really off topic. But okay.
Well, no, it goes back to your point about
because I think that the government should feed hungry children. Is that really a big deal? Like, I think that's a fair enough ask of the government. They should keep their people healthy, happy, and safe. I think.
Yes, I agree. I agree with you that a role of a government is to provide them the human rights. That's fine. That like that in terms of caring about the people, that's something they can do. But it's there's a fine line there.
Yeah, I agree.
Right. What I want to do is I want to do a little quick exercise here. So we're gonna go. I'm gonna run through the options. Okay, the options the three options being these food packages we've seen, the cash in hand potential scheme that a couple of people have talked about, and the voucher scheme. And I want you to put your hand up if that's the one that you agree with. Okay, so let's start off with the cash in hand. Who thinks that's the right thing? No one. Okay, what about the voucher scheme? Everyone, including me. Okay, that's fine. So that's sorted. Everyone here thinks that the government should pursue once again the voucher scheme, and I have to say I think it's only fair, because we've seen that perhaps private companies are taking advantage of this food packaging scheme. Obviously, the cash in hand scheme, I expressed a number of concerns about that, and I will continue to do so. I don't think that's the right idea. You need to make sure that this money is being spent on food after all, and I think that's what the voucher scheme would allow. But I want to move on because I want to finish with some good news, which is about vaccinations. So we're going to talk about the vaccine rollout. 5% of the UK's population have now been vaccinated with a single dose. Over 3 million vaccination doses have now been administered. We're first in Europe on this front. We are fourth in the world. Israel are leading. They have vaccinated 25% of their population. Of course, their population is tiny, around 9 million off the top of my head. Now, when we're looking at European comparisons, I want to talk a bit about France. They've only vaccinated 0.5% of their population. Germany have vaccinated 1% of their population. And across the EU, it is less than 1%. And this is the problem. I don't think the EU have looked at this in the right way. They are doing it on a continental basis. They are doing a continental vaccine rollout. Here in the UK, we got our vaccines approved weeks before they approved theirs, and we rolled it out. But I don't want to talk about comparisons too much, because this is good news. Go to Pierce first then.
Well, yeah, I mean, the whole vaccine situation is good news. One thing that in the press conference, 2 hours ago now, the government said that they would, well, it was kind of tricky to interpret, but they said that this was an international problem, which it is, and that they would be shipping some vaccines overseas. And I'm a bit conflicted about that, because if they're already in Britain, you might as well use them for Britain, and especially if they're sending them to places where there's not the infrastructure to keep them safe and ready to use, then that's just a waste of vaccines, and it'd be safe to keep them in Britain.
Okay, so what I want to pose a question to the whole panel here. Do you think that frontline workers from our police forces and our education services, for example, should be vaccinated at a higher tier to the rest of the general population? Because this has been a raging debate over the last few weeks, and the politicians have kind of shied away from it a little bit on both sides, it's worth saying. Keir Starmer said that he didn't think they should be added to the top 4 tiers. The government's position is, of course, that they shouldn't be, because the JCVI, who are an independent body, have decided on these. My personal view is that we shouldn't be adding these frontline workers to the top 4 categories from police services, education services, and equivalent, because from what the scientists are saying, it wouldn't make too much of a difference in terms of the infections. So I think the priorities we've got at the moment are correct. I do think that it will be very important to get teachers vaccinated, because that will make schools safer, definitely. But I don't think they should take precedent over any of our current top 4 tiers. Tommy, do you want to talk about this a little bit?
Yeah, about the vaccinations, like I said, I somewhat agree that I don't think that they should be put into the top 4 priority group, because if we're closing the schools, if we're not essentially going anywhere outside, what's the point of getting the teachers vaccinated if they're not in school? But obviously, if they do move kids back to the school environments, I would wholeheartedly support that. And I'm not one to typically congratulate the Tory government, I guess you could say. I'm not the biggest admirer of either of the 2 leading parties in the UK, but I think they've done incredibly well with this vaccine so far. 5% already of the population in a few weeks, I think it is, it's a great rate, and about just under 1% have already had their second dose. However, something quite concerning is that on polls conducted in December, 71% said that they would be comfortable taking the vaccine, and that's 29% too few. I think if we don't get the whole population vaccinated, whether they like it or not, it's just not going to work. Like, it's either all or nothing, because there's the few that don't take the vaccine, they can affect, and it's still going to be there. There's always going to be the few, but in general, I think the government have done well with the initial vaccine rollout. Let's just see how they can continue that at a stable rate, because keeping continuity is another big factor that I have to go for.
So Tommy, would you advocate for mandatory vaccinations in that case?
Yes, I would.
Felix, would you advocate for mandatory vaccinations?
Of course, I would, because we need to, especially people who can't take vaccines. There is a reason that herd immunity exists, and it's for them. So when we start having these anti-vaxxers, it really disrupts the flow of the vaccine and can really have dangerous consequences. I don't want to make this a big anti-vaxxer debate right now, because I think, but that would be an interesting topic to go on more. But I have to say, again, I agree with Tommy. I have to really congratulate the Tory government here, because they've done a great job with these vaccines. They've got them out well, and it's been really well organized, I think, in general. My just a few kind of points would be like the 24-hour vaccinations. We need to get them going as quick as possible. And I also think the rate limiting factor currently is the vaccine dose. So that has to pick up a bit, so that we can getting as many people vaccinated as possible to make it as efficient as possible, and to get as many people vaccinated. I do think that we should be prioritizing. We should be putting bus drivers, I think, should definitely be going into priority groups, as well as maybe train drivers not as exposed, but bus drivers definitely, because they've been one of the kind of forgotten groups, which have had over 10% of the workforce on the buses currently are isolating or ill. So that is definitely a worry at the minute. So I think maybe they should be moving up into priority groups. Teachers, not yet. I agree with that. But doctors, we need to get them vaccinated right now, because they are battling with this COVID pandemic, and we're in the peak. We're right now in the peak of the COVID pandemic. So as quick as possible, we need to get these ICU doctors and nurses and healthcare professionals vaccinated as quick as possible.
I completely agree. It's absolutely crucial. I mean, we're seeing at the moment, I believe, the highest numbers of NHS staff actually out of our hospitals and work at the very time when we need so many in it because of COVID reasons. It's imperative we get these people vaccinated. And I believe as well that the government are doing a good job on this, actually. We're moving very fast.
Yeah, I've just got a quick point. It's about the adding the key workers to the tier system. I mean, the government's been famously fond of adding tiers, so I don't see why they can't just add a tier 5 to the rollout of the vaccine. Vaccinate the 4 tiers first, and then go on to key workers. That's
It's a fair point. I mean, it really depends, I think, at the end of the day, on what the scientists say and whether they think that it will dent the infection rate and the cases rate. In the moment, they're saying that it wouldn't make a potential difference. So, Jose, what do you want to say about this?
Well, first, we want to say I agree with Felix that doctors and bus drivers should be put at priority. It doesn't really matter that much their age. I think they're fighting this. As soon as bus drivers get into it, get the vaccination, that can maybe open it up a bit more, because they can feel a bit safer. But going back to the point, I'm actually quite conflicted about whether we should be putting people who don't want to accept the vaccination on a list, because I'm thoroughly against the government taking somewhat control over people's lives and stuff like that. However, I think in this case, and this is a huge exception, I do think the government need to not exactly put people on the list, but say, if you don't take this, there will be consequences. Not fines or anything, but not be allowed in certain places. Because at the end of the day, they're a threat if they don't want to take it. And the government don't really want to handle that. And I agree with that. If they don't want to handle it, it's not a problem. it's not their problem. It's the
I actually totally agree, and I'm in exactly the same position as Jose. I really hate the idea of the state having this much control over its people. But in this case, well, I also make an exception. I think it's imperative we get these vaccines into people's arms. We need to get back to normal as much as possible. People are suffering, our economy is suffering. It's absolutely imperative that we get back to normal as soon as physically possible, even if it's significantly faster than the rest of the world, which could impact trade, for example. It's still imperative that we get this country back up and running. Felix, do you want to make the last point for today?
So I just kind of want to make a more general point, just carrying on from a few sentiments there, because I think getting vaccine into the arms is very, very crucial. But one thing the government have forgotten during this pandemic is the COVID situation is inextricably linked to the economy, and we've been focusing too much on the economy. We focus on the COVID, then you get the economy running, and I think that's one thing that we've missed. We need to learn from.
Well, yeah, and of course, as I mentioned at the start, we saw the economic figures come in yesterday from November, and the economy shrunk by 2.6% once again. It's really worrying what's happening to our economy, and because the economy and people are so interlinked, without a functioning economy, people will suffer, and it's definitely a big concern that I have. But I want to leave it on a good note. The vaccinations are happening. This is the good news. The rollout is happening very, very fast. We'll have all the top 4 priority groups done by the end of February, I believe, and that will be really positive. I reckon, and this is a wild prediction, that by the summer we will be back to some sense of normality. And I want to end it on that note. Let's all think of the normality.
First, thank you all for sticking around till the end of the video. Now for the very special announcement. I'm here to announce that we are interviewing Monica Harding, who was the Lib Dem candidate for Esher and Walton, and she went up against Dominic Raab, who is obviously the Foreign Secretary, and she increased the vote for her by nearly triple in the area, which is just incredible against such a prominent government figure. So we're going to be interviewing her very, very soon, so you better subscribe and follow all our socials to make sure you get all the updates on that. Big thank you to Cameron for hosting, and big thank you to you for watching.